Millionaire buys bride for one night of love, but ends up marrying her forever. Before we explore all the details of this incredible story, tell us where you're following us from and the time. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a thing, and let's embark on this journey together. The grandfather clock in the Grand Plaza Hotel lobby struck midnight, its deep chimes echoing through the marble-adorned space. Helena Brooks adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses, a habit that surfaced whenever the night shift settled into its quietest hours. Her perfectly styled braids caught the warm light from the crystal chandeliers above, creating a crown-like effect that matched her natural dignity. At 29, Helena had mastered the art of being present yet invisible, a skill honed through years of working the front desk at one of New York's most prestigious hotels. Her tailored black blazer and crisp white shirt spoke of professionalism, while her subtle gold accessories honored the heritage she carried with pride. "Another coffee, Miss Brooks." The night security guard's voice drew her attention from the computer screen. Helena's lips curved into a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Not tonight, Marcus. One more cup and I'll be too wired for my morning shift at the cafe." The mention of her second job brought a familiar weight to her shoulders. 2 jobs, countless hours, and a dream of writing that lived in the margins of her moleskin notebook. This was her reality. She straightened her 5'10" frame, her presence commanding despite her desire to blend into the background. The hotel's revolving doors spun suddenly, bringing in a gust of autumn air and a man whose presence seemed to alter the very atmosphere of the lobby. Brian Whitmore moved with the confidence of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. His 6'3" frame was wrapped in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, and his steel blue eyes carried the weight of empire-building decisions. Helena had seen him check in 3 days ago, the CEO of Whitmore Industries, a name that frequented business magazines and financial news. She'd processed his registration with professional detachment, noting the way he barely looked at her, his attention divided between his phone and his personal assistant's rapid-fire schedule updates. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was alone. "Miss Brooks." His voice carried the refined edge of old money and Ivy League education. "I find myself in need of dinner recommendations at this unfortunate hour." Helena's fingers stilled over her keyboard. The late-night food question was common enough, but something in his tone made her look up. His well-groomed beard couldn't hide the tension in his jaw, and despite his impeccable appearance, there was an undercurrent of exhaustion in his stance. "That depends, Mr. Whitmore," she replied, her voice carrying the warm professionalism she'd perfected over years of customer service. "Are you looking for sustenance or an experience?" A flash of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by interest. "I wasn't aware those were mutually exclusive options." In New York, at midnight, Helena allowed herself a genuine half-smile. "They can be very different things." Brian leaned slightly against the counter, his expensive watch catching the light. "Enlighten me." "For sustenance, there's a 24-hour diner 3 blocks east that serves the best French toast in Manhattan. For an experience," she paused, considering, "there's a hidden Japanese restaurant in the basement of the old Wilson building. They serve until 2 a.m., and their chef has 2 Michelin stars." "You seem well-versed in the city's nocturnal offerings," Brian observed, studying her with new interest. "It's my job to know." Helena adjusted her glasses again, a tell she'd never managed to eliminate. "And which would you choose?" The question hung in the air, personal in a way that made Helena's carefully constructed walls shift uncomfortably. She'd learned the hard way about men in expensive suits, asking seemingly innocent questions. Her last relationship had taught her that lesson thoroughly. "The diner," she answered finally. "Sometimes authenticity matters more than acclaim." Brian's eyebrows rose slightly, and something that might have been a real smile touched his lips. "A philosophy that extends beyond food, I imagine." Their eyes met for a moment too long to be strictly professional. Helena felt a flutter of warning in her chest, the same instinct that had kept her focused on survival rather than living for the past 2 years. "Would you care to join me?" The invitation landed between them like a stone in still water. Helena blinked, certain she'd misheard. "I'm sorry." "Join me for a late dinner," Brian repeated, his confidence wavering for just a fraction of a second. "You've piqued my curiosity about this diner, and I find myself reluctant to dine alone tonight." Helena's mind raced through all the reasons this was a terrible idea. Office policy about fraternizing with guests, the fact that she had another shift in 7 hours, the memory of trust betrayed and promises broken. But something in the way he stood there, powerful yet somehow vulnerable in this midnight moment, made her hesitate. There was a story in his eyes that didn't match the narrative of the ruthless CEO she'd read about. "I can't leave the desk unattended," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew they sounded like what they were, an excuse. "I'll wait." His response was immediate, surprising them both. "Your shift ends at 2 a.m., correct? The restaurant you mentioned, the one with the Michelin stars, would still be open." Helena felt the weight of a choice pressing down on her. In romance novels, this would be the moment where fate intervened, where the heroine took a chance that would change her life. But Helena had stopped believing in those stories long ago. "Mr. Whitmore." "Brian," he corrected softly, "and this isn't what you think. No expectations, no complications. Just dinner and conversation with someone who seems to understand the difference between sustenance and experience." The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its sound filling the space between them. Helena looked at this man, really looked at him, and saw something familiar in his solitude. Perhaps they were both hiding behind their perfectly constructed facades. "Okay," she heard herself say, the word slipping out before she could catch it. "But I choose the place." Brian's smile was genuine this time, transforming his entire face. "I look forward to your expertise, Miss Brooks." "Helena," she offered, surprising herself again. As he walked toward the elevators, Helena felt the familiar urge to write. This moment, this strange, unexpected midnight encounter, felt like the beginning of something. She just wasn't sure if it was something wonderful or dangerous. She pulled out her notebook and began to write, her elegant handwriting filling the page. Sometimes the most significant moments come disguised as ordinary decisions. "Tonight I said yes to dinner with a stranger who doesn't feel strange at all." Maybe that's the most terrifying part. The night continued its slow dance toward dawn, but something had shifted in the air of the Grand Plaza Hotel. Change had arrived, wearing a perfectly tailored suit and carrying questions that Helena wasn't sure she was ready to answer. The autumn sun hadn't yet risen when Helena pushed open the heavy glass door of the Daily Grind, her second workplace. Her body moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago mastered the art of surviving on minimal sleep. The midnight dinner with Brian Whitmore had ended just 3 hours ago, leaving her mind spinning with thoughts she couldn't afford to entertain. The cafe's interior welcomed her with its familiar scent of freshly ground coffee beans and aged wooden floors. Helena's fingers traced the worn edge of the counter as she made her way behind it, her braids now pulled back into a neat bun for her morning shift. The memory of Brian's intense gaze across the intimate table of the Japanese restaurant lingered like a shadow she couldn't shake. "You're here early," called out Mia, her co-worker, emerging from the storage room with fresh pastries. The petite Asian woman's sharp eyes didn't miss the subtle dark circles under Helena's glasses. "Rough night at the hotel?" Helena busied herself with the espresso machine, avoiding Mia's knowing look. "Just different," she answered carefully, the weight of her notebook heavy in her bag. She'd filled 3 pages after returning home, words flowing like a river breaking through a dam. The bell above the door chimed, and Helena's heart stuttered before common sense reminded her that Brian Whitmore wouldn't be caught dead in a modest coffee shop at 5:30 a.m. Instead, the usual parade of early morning customers began trickling in, office workers, joggers, and students, all desperate for their caffeine fix. But at exactly 7:15 a.m., the door opened again, and James Delaney walked in, his casual elegance a stark contrast to the rushed energy of the other customers. His presence was unexpected enough to make Helena pause mid-pour. "1 Americano and 1 conversation, please," he said, leaning against the counter with an easy smile that didn't quite mask the calculation in his eyes. His mixed heritage was evident in his features, adding to his natural charisma. Helena finished the drink she was making, handed it to its waiting recipient, and turned to face Brian's right-hand man. "The Americano I can manage. The conversation wasn't on our menu last time I checked." James's laugh was genuine. "I can see why he's intrigued." He adjusted his position, the sleeve of his designer blazer riding up to reveal an expensive watch, different from Brian's but equally tasteful. Brian doesn't usually do spontaneous dinners with hotel employees. "If this is some kind of warning," Helena started, her voice cooling several degrees. "Quite the opposite," James interrupted, his expression turning serious. "I'm here because I've known Brian for 15 years, and last night was the first time I've seen him text me about someone at 3 a.m. Helena's hands stilled on the coffee grinder. "Mr. Delaney, James, please, and before you build those walls any higher, hear me out." He glanced around the nearly empty cafe. "Is there somewhere we can talk? 5 minutes, I promise." Against her better judgment, Helena nodded to Mia and led James to the small alcove near the window, where mismatched armchairs created a cozy reading nook. The morning light was starting to paint Manhattan's streets gold, catching the subtle threads in James's casual blazer. "Brian is—" James paused, choosing his words carefully. "He's not what the business magazines make him out to be. Yes, he's driven. Yes, he's successful. But he's also carrying the weight of expectations that would crush most people." "Why are you telling me this?" Helena asked, though part of her already knew the answer. James leaned forward, his voice dropping. "Because in all the years I've known him, I've never seen him look at someone the way he looked at you last night. And based on the security footage I reviewed this morning, it wasn't just at dinner." Helena felt her cheeks warm. "You watch the security tapes?" "It's my job to protect him. From corporate raiders, from bad press, from himself sometimes." James's smile turned wry. "But I'm not here to protect him from you. I'm here to tell you that whatever happened last night, it was real." The weight of those words settled around Helena like a heavy cloak. She thought about the way Brian had listened to her talk about her dreams of writing, how his carefully maintained facade had cracked when she mentioned her father's death, how his hand had hovered near hers, but never touched, respecting boundaries she hadn't even voiced. "He's the CEO of a Fortune 500 company," Helena said finally. "I work 2 jobs just to afford a small apartment in Brooklyn, and yet you both light up when you talk about 19th century literature," James countered. "You both carry old souls in a world obsessed with the new. You both wear masks so perfectly that you've almost forgotten they're masks at all." Helena adjusted her glasses, a gesture that felt like exposure now. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "Nothing, everything." James stood, straightening his blazer. "I'm just the messenger, Helena. But know this, when Brian returns to the hotel tonight, it won't be just because his corporate meetings run late." He turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and Helena, the book you mentioned last night, the one about the lighthouse keeper's daughter, he ordered it at 4 a.m., had it delivered to his office. He's probably reading it right now instead of reviewing quarterly reports." The bell chimed again as James left, leaving Helena alone with thoughts that threatened to overflow the carefully constructed boundaries of her life. She pulled out her notebook, hands trembling slightly as she wrote, "Sometimes people enter your life like characters from a story you never knew you were writing. They see through the careful editing, the revised versions of yourself, straight to the first draft, raw, unpolished, but perhaps more true than anything that came after." The morning rush began in earnest, but Helena's mind kept drifting to the way Brian had looked at her across that restaurant table, like he was seeing something precious and rare. It terrified her, how much she wanted him to look at her that way again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, a text from an unknown number. The lighthouse keeper's daughter made a choice between safety and the storm. I find myself understanding her dilemma better with each page. B. Helena stared at the message until Mia's voice snapped her back to reality. But as she returned to making lattes and taking orders, something had shifted inside her. The walls she'd built so carefully were still standing, but for the first time in years, she wondered if perhaps they were meant to have a door. In his corner office 40 stories above the city, Brian Whitmore set down a worn copy of The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, his steel blue eyes distant with thought. On his desk, next to stacks of contracts and merger proposals, lay a simple business card from the Daily Grind, bearing the cafe's address and operating hours. His fingers traced the embossed letters as he wrestled with decisions that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the heart he'd thought he'd locked away years ago. The morning sun climbed higher over New York City, illuminating 2 souls caught in the delicate dance of possibility, each wondering if they dared to risk the safety of solitude for the dangerous promise of connection. And somewhere between them, James Delaney smiled, knowing that sometimes the best business strategy was letting the heart take the lead. 2 weeks had passed since that first midnight dinner, and Helena found herself living in 2 worlds. In one, she maintained her carefully structured routine, morning shifts at the cafe, night shifts at the hotel, stolen moments with her notebook. In the other, she existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in brief encounters with Brian Whitmore that felt increasingly like scenes from a story she hadn't meant to write. Tonight, the Grand Plaza's lobby was quieter than usual. Helena's fingers moved across her keyboard, logging the day's reports, but her mind kept drifting to the way Brian had looked at her over breakfast that morning. He'd made it a habit to visit the Daily Grind just before closing her morning shift, always ordering a simple black coffee he barely touched while they discussed books, dreams, and the spaces between words. The sharp click of expensive shoes against marble pulled her from her thoughts. Brian emerged from the elevator, his usual composed demeanor fractured by something she couldn't quite name. His tie was slightly loosened, a detail so out of character it made her breath catch. Helena. Her name on his lips still sent shivers down her spine. "Are you free to talk?" She glanced at the empty lobby, then at Marcus, the security guard who had become accustomed to their late-night conversations. He nodded, understanding without words. 10 minutes, she said, stepping out from behind the desk. Brian led her to a quiet corner of the lobby, where leather armchairs created an illusion of privacy. The crystal chandeliers cast shadows that danced across his face, highlighting the tension in his jaw. "Something's wrong," Helena observed, perching on the edge of one chair while Brian remained standing, his 6'3" frame radiating nervous energy. "Not wrong," he said, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Complicated." He paused, then added softly, "Everything about you makes things complicated." Helena felt her walls rising. "Mr. Whitmore, don't!" His voice was rough. "Don't go back to formalities. Not now." She fell silent, watching as he paced a tight circle before finally facing her. "The board meeting today was challenging," he began. "Whitmore Industries is facing a hostile takeover attempt. The vultures think I'm vulnerable because I'm single, unattached. They're painting me as unstable, uncommitted." His laugh was bitter. Apparently, in their world, a man without a wife might as well be a boy without a compass. Helena's heart thumped painfully against her ribs. "I don't understand what this has to do with me." Brian knelt before her chair, close enough that she could see the flecks of grey in his blue eyes. "I need a wife, Helena. Someone intelligent, dignified, real. Someone who understands the weight of appearances but isn't consumed by them." His voice dropped to a whisper. "I need you." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "What exactly are you saying?" "I'm proposing a marriage of convenience." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken implications. 1 year, maybe 2, long enough to stabilize the company and shut down the takeover attempts. Helena stood abruptly, needing distance. Her mind raced through all the romance novels she'd devoured as a teenager, all the stories where business arrangements turned to love. But this wasn't fiction, and she wasn't a character who could afford to believe in fairy tales. "You're asking me to pretend to be in love with you." Her voice shook slightly. "I'm asking you to be yourself, just beside me." Brian stood too, his height making her look up. "You'd want for nothing. A new apartment, financial security, time to write your book." "Stop." Helena held up a hand. "You don't know what you're offering. You don't know me." "I know you write in that notebook when you think no one's watching," he countered. "I know you adjust your glasses when you're nervous, like you're doing right now. I know you drink chai tea in the morning, but switch to coffee after noon. I know you read the last page of a book first, because you're afraid of unhappy endings." Tears pricked at Helena's eyes. "Those are details, not truths." "Then give me time to learn your truths." Brian stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "This isn't just about business, Helena. These past 2 weeks, something's happening between us, something real. Something fragile," she corrected. "Something that would shatter under the weight of what you're proposing." The grandfather clock chimed midnight, its sound echoing through the lobby like a warning. Helena wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hold together the pieces of her carefully constructed world. "I need time," she whispered. "Of course." Brian's hand moved as if to touch her face, then dropped. "But time isn't something I have much of. The board meets again in 3 days." Helena nodded, unable to trust her voice. She turned to walk back to her desk, but Brian's words stopped her. "When I was 12, he said softly, "my father told me that Whitmore men don't marry for love. We marry for legacy, for the company, for the future. I've spent 26 years believing that until I met you." She didn't turn around, but her steps faltered. "Even if this starts as business," he continued, "I can't help feeling it could become something else, something true." Helena returned to her desk, her movements mechanical. She pulled out her notebook, needing to capture the chaos in her heart. "They say the most dangerous decisions are the ones that feel like destiny and madness all at once. Tonight, a man offered me a fairy tale wrapped in a business contract, and I'm terrified, not because it feels wrong, but because it feels like something I've been waiting for, without knowing I was waiting." Across the lobby, Brian watched her write, his own heart wrestling with emotions he hadn't planned for. In his pocket, his phone buzzed, probably James wanting an update on the proposal, but for now he stood in silence, watching the woman who had somehow become the intersection of everything he needed and everything he feared. Outside, New York City continued its endless dance of lights and shadows, unaware that in the Grand Plaza Hotel, two souls stood on the precipice of a decision that would either break them or make them whole. In her apartment that night, Helena couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, looking out at the Brooklyn Bridge, its lights a string of pearls against the dark water. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her best friend, but she couldn't talk about this. Not yet. Instead, she opened her messages, finding the thread with Brian's number. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as dawn approached, writing and deleting the same words over and over. What if we both end up broken? But in the end, she sent something else entirely. Tell me about the lighthouse keeper's daughter again. Did she regret choosing the storm? Across the city, in his penthouse office, Brian smiled at the message. He picked up the book from his desk, found the passage she meant, and typed, "She didn't regret the storm. She regretted all the years she spent fearing it." In the quiet hours before sunrise, 2 people lay awake in different parts of the city, both knowing that whatever answer came in 3 days' time would change everything. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what they both needed. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Brian's office on the 40th floor of Whitmore Tower. Helena sat across from him, her back straight, fingers intertwined in her lap to hide their trembling. The city sprawled below them like a dream, but her focus remained on the document before her, a marriage contract that would rewrite her entire existence. "You're sure about this?" James asked from his position by the window, his usually casual demeanor replaced by genuine concern. He'd been surprised when Helena had texted her answer last night, a simple yes that had set everything in motion. "I am," Helena replied, her voice steadier than she felt. She'd spent the last 3 days examining this decision from every angle, filling pages of her notebook with pros and cons, fears and hopes. In the end, it wasn't logic that decided. It was the way her heart raced every time she thought of walking away. Brian sat behind his massive desk, his presence both commanding and uncertain. He'd loosened his tie slightly, a habit Helena had noticed he only displayed when emotions threatened his carefully maintained control. "The terms are straightforward," he said, his deep voice softer than usual. 2 years of marriage, you'll have access to all Whitmore family resources, a monthly allowance, a new apartment, or house, if you prefer. Complete financial independence. Helena nodded, her braids catching the morning light. "And in return, I play the role of devoted wife, attend functions, support your public image." Her glasses needed adjusting, but she forced her hands to stay still. "Be convincing. Be yourself," Brian corrected, their eyes meeting across the expensive wooden desk. "That's all I've ever wanted." James cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "There are additional provisions, privacy clauses, confidentiality agreements, and—" he hesitated, glancing at Brian. "And terms for if real feelings develop," Brian finished, his blue-gray eyes never leaving Helena's face. "If this becomes more than an arrangement." Helena's heart skipped. She thought about their breakfast conversations, the way Brian leaned in when she spoke about her writing, how he remembered every detail she mentioned in passing. Perhaps it was already more than an arrangement, but neither of them was ready to face that truth. "The board meets at 2, James reminded them gently. "If we're doing this, we need signatures now." Helena picked up the gold pen Brian had placed before her, a Mont Blanc that probably cost more than a month's rent at her Brooklyn apartment. The weight of it in her hand made everything feel real. "Wait," Brian said suddenly, standing. "James, give us a moment." James nodded, understanding passing between the old friends before he left the office, closing the heavy door behind him. Brian circled the desk, his tall frame casting a shadow over the contract. "Before you sign, I need you to know something." He knelt beside her chair, a position that should have seemed awkward for a CEO, but somehow felt right. "This isn't just about the company." "Brian," Helena started, but he shook his head. "These past weeks, getting to know you, it's woken something in me I thought I'd buried years ago. The way you see the world, how you find beauty in small moments, your quiet strength, it's changed how I see everything." Tears threatened at the corners of Helena's eyes. "Don't make promises you can't keep." "I'm not promising love," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm promising truth. Whatever happens between us, it will be real. No pretense, no games, just 2 people trying to find their way through this strange situation we've created." Helena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the moment press against her chest. When she opened them again, Brian had moved closer, close enough that she could see the subtle flecks of silver in his dark hair. "My turn for truth," she whispered. "I'm terrified, Not of the marriage or the public scrutiny or even the possibility of failure. I'm terrified of how much I want this to work, not for the contract, but for us. Brian's hand found hers, warm and steady. Then we're both terrified. Maybe that's the best foundation we could ask for. Honest fear rather than false confidence. The morning light shifted, painting patterns across the contract before them. Helena looked down at their joined hands, his pale against her dark skin, both trembling slightly with the weight of what they were about to do. James mentioned a press conference, she said, trying to ground herself in practicalities. This afternoon, after the board meeting. Brian stood, but kept hold of her hand. A whirlwind romance, secret dates, a proposal that couldn't wait. The media will love it. And us? Helena asked, finally voicing the question that had haunted her for days. What will we be to each other? Brian's thumb traced circles on her palm. Partners, friends, maybe more, but most importantly, real. Everything else we can figure out day by day. Helena reached for the pen with her free hand. Her signature flowed across the page, elegant and sure despite her inner turmoil. Brian signed next, his bold strokes a contrast to her flowing script. Mrs. Whitmore, he tested the words, making them sound like both a question and a promise. Not yet, Helena corrected, managing a small smile. First, we have to convince the world we're madly in love. That, Brian said softly, helping her stand, might be the easiest part of all. James returned, carrying a garment bag that Helena hadn't noticed before. Your dress for the press conference, he explained. And Helena, the hair and makeup team is waiting in the executive lounge. Reality crashed back in waves. In less than 4 hours, she would stand before cameras and microphones, playing the role of a woman swept off her feet by one of New York's most eligible bachelors. Except it wouldn't be entirely a role, and that's what scared her most. I'll see you at 1:30, Brian said, his CEO mask sliding back into place. But his eyes, when they met hers, held the same mix of fear and hope she felt in her own heart. In the executive bathroom, changing into a dress that probably cost more than her yearly rent, Helena pulled out her notebook one last time as Helena Brooks. They say life changes in big moments, graduations, births, deaths, but sometimes it changes in the scratch of a pen, in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the decision to stop watching life and start living it. Today I choose the storm. She closed the notebook, tucked it into her bag and faced her reflection. The woman who stared back wore designer clothes and uncertainty with equal grace. In a few hours, she would become Mrs. Brian Whitmore, and a new chapter would begin. Outside the bathroom, New York City continued its endless dance, unaware that in a tower high above its streets, two people had just signed a contract that would either break their hearts or heal them. Perhaps Helena thought as she squared her shoulders, it would do both. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what they both needed. The executive lounge of Whitmore Tower hummed with nervous energy. Helena stood before a full-length mirror, barely recognizing herself. The stylist team had worked magic, transforming her practical braids into an elegant updo that framed her face perfectly. The deep burgundy dress hugged her curves while maintaining sophistication, exactly what one would expect from a future Mrs. Whitmore. 5 minutes until the press conference, James announced, entering the room with his tablet in hand. He paused, taking in Helena's transformation. You look perfect, but something's missing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. From Brian. Helena's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside lay a delicate gold necklace with a small pendant shaped like an open book. A tiny lighthouse was etched on one page, waves on the other. Her throat tightened with emotion. He had it made this morning, James said softly. Rush order from his family's jeweler. Before Helena could respond, Brian appeared in the doorway. He'd changed into a fresh charcoal suit that made his eyes look stormy. For a moment, he just stared at her, all his careful composure stripped away. Helena, he breathed, crossing the room in long strides. You're convincing, she offered, trying to lighten the suddenly heavy atmosphere. Real, he corrected, taking the necklace from the box. May I? She turned, feeling his warm fingers brush her neck as he fastened the clasp. In the mirror, they looked like something out of a magazine spread, the powerful CEO and his elegant bride-to-be. But the tender way his hands lingered on her shoulders told a different story. The board approved unanimously, he murmured, just for her ears. Now comes the harder part. Convincing the world we're in love? Helena asked, meeting his eyes in the reflection. Convincing ourselves we're not. The words hung between them, dangerous in their honesty. Before either could address them, James cleared his throat. "It's time. Remember the story we practiced?" He handed them each a small card. "Key points for the press. Keep it simple, romantic, believable." Helena scanned the card. Secret dates, whirlwind romance, love at first sight. The irony wasn't lost on her. Their fabricated story felt more conventional than the truth. The elevator ride to the press room was silent, filled with unspoken tensions. Brian's hand found hers just as the doors opened, and she was surprised by how natural it felt, how their fingers interlaced, as if they'd done this 1,000 times. Camera flashes exploded the moment they entered. Helena felt Brian's grip tighten reassuringly as they approached the podium. The room was packed with reporters, all hungry for details about New York's most surprising engagement. "Good afternoon," Brian began, his CEO voice in full effect. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I'm here today to announce my engagement to the remarkable Helena Brooks." More flashes, more murmurs. Helena maintained her smile, channeling every romance novel heroine she'd ever read about. "Mr. Whitmore, how did you meet?" Brian's smile turned genuine as he looked at her. "Sometimes the greatest things in life happen in the most ordinary moments. I was checking into a hotel, distracted by work, when I heard a voice that made me look up, really look up, for the first time in years." Helena felt tears threatening. They'd rehearsed this story, but something in his tone made it feel unexpectedly authentic. "Miss Brooks, what attracted you to Mr. Whitmore?" Taking a deep breath, Helena stepped forward. "His ability to see me," she said simply. "Not my job or my circumstances, but me." It wasn't the practiced answer on their cards, but it was true. Was it really love at first sight? Brian's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "No," he answered, surprising everyone, including James, who stiffened visibly. "It was something better. It was recognition. Looking at Helena was like finding a piece of myself I didn't know was missing." The reporters ate it up, scribbling frantically. Helena's heart raced. This wasn't in the script. "When's the wedding?" "Next month," Brian announced, causing another explosion of questions. "When you find the right person, why wait?" After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, James called an end to the questions. As they made their way back to the elevator, Helena felt dizzy with the surreal nature of it all. "You went off script," she whispered once they were alone in Brian's office. "I told the truth," he replied, loosening his tie. "Just not all of it." Helena sank into one of the leather chairs, suddenly exhausted. "What happens now?" "Now?" Brian moved to the window, looking out at the city. "Now we move you into the penthouse. Start planning a wedding that will satisfy both the board and the media. Create a life together, even if it's built on carefully chosen truths." "And us?" Helena asked, touching the lighthouse pendant at her throat. "What happens to us?" Brian turned, the setting sun casting shadows across his face. "That's the one thing I can't plan or control, and maybe that's exactly how it should be." James entered with a stack of newspapers, already featuring their engagement announcement online. The media's calling it the romance of the year. Stock prices are up 12% just from the press conference. He paused, looking between them. "You two were convincing. We should celebrate," Brian said suddenly. "The three of us. No cameras, no scripts. Just dinner and truth. The truth being that you're both terrible at sticking to a plan," James quipped, but his smile was warm. "I know just the place." Hours later, in a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, Helena watched Brian and James share stories from their college days. The formal masks had slipped away, replaced by genuine laughter and comfortable silences. Under the table, Brian's hand rested on her knee, a touch that felt both intimate and natural. She pulled out her notebook, no longer hiding the action. "Perhaps the greatest deception isn't in what we tell the world, but in what we tell ourselves. Today, I stood before cameras and told a half-truth about falling in love. The deception wasn't in the falling, it was in pretending I hadn't already fallen." Brian glanced over, catching her writing. Instead of looking away, she let him read. His eyes softened, and his hand found hers again, their fingers intertwining on top of the table this time. James watched them with knowing eyes, raising his wine glass in a quiet toast. "To convincing performances," he said, his voice heavy with meaning. "To truth in unexpected places," Brian added, his eyes never leaving Helena's face. "To lighthouses in storms," Helena finished softly, touching her necklace. Outside, New York City sparkled with millions of lights, each one telling its own story of love, deception, and the blurry space between. In a quiet restaurant, Three people sat surrounded by the weight of secrets and the lightness of possibility, each knowing that the greatest stories are often the ones we never meant to tell. And somewhere in the night, a clock ticked forward, counting down to a wedding that would either expose their careful lies or transform them into the truest thing they'd ever known. The penthouse at the Metropolitan felt like another world entirely. Helena stood in what was now her closet, a room larger than her old Brooklyn apartment, surrounded by designer clothes she was still afraid to touch. 3 days had passed since she'd moved in, and everything still felt like a dream she might wake from at any moment. "The wedding planner will be here in an hour," Brian's voice came from the doorway. He was already dressed for the office, his tie perfectly knotted, but his eyes were soft as he watched her. "Are you sure you don't want me to reschedule?" Helena shook her head, adjusting her glasses. "I can handle it. Besides, you have that merger meeting with the West Coast team." He stepped into the closet, his presence filling the space in a way that made her heart race. "You know you don't have to prove anything, right? This is your home now, your life. You get to set the pace." "Our life," she corrected gently, reaching up to straighten his already perfect tie. The gesture felt domestic, intimate in a way that made them both pause. "I'm fine, Brian. Really." His hand caught hers before she could pull away, thumb brushing over her engagement ring, a stunning vintage piece that had belonged to his grandmother. "You haven't been writing," he observed. "I haven't seen your notebook since the press conference." Helena's breath caught. She hadn't realized he'd been paying such close attention. "I've been processing." "Processing what?" "Everything. This." She gestured around them. "How my entire life changed in a week. How natural it feels to wake up and see your coffee cup on the counter. How terrifying that is." Brian's other hand came up to cup her face, the touch so gentle it made her eyes sting. "Talk to me, Helena. No cameras, no pretense. Just us." She leaned into his touch despite herself. "I keep waiting for the act to feel like an act, for this to feel wrong or forced. But it doesn't, and that scares me more than any contract or press conference." "I know," he whispered, and she could see the same fear reflected in his steel blue eyes. "Every morning I wake up expecting to hear you making tea in the kitchen, and when I do, something settles in my chest that I didn't even know was restless." The sound of the elevator chiming broke the moment. James's voice carried through the penthouse. "Please tell me you're both decent, because I'm coming in with wedding details that can't wait." They stepped apart, but something had shifted in the air between them. Helena grabbed a cream-colored blazer from one of the hangers, still marveling that this was her life now, and followed Brian to the living room. James was spreading papers across the coffee table, his casual elegance somehow making the formal room feel more lived in. "Good morning, future power couple. We have decisions to make." "The wedding planner will be here soon," Helena reminded him, settling onto the sofa. "Exactly why we need to align on the big items first." James pulled out his tablet. "The media's expecting the society wedding of the year, but we need to balance that with authenticity. Helena, this is where you come in." She raised an eyebrow. "Me? You're our reality check. Every time we veer too far into billionaire spectacle territory, you pull us back to what matters." Brian, who had been checking emails on his phone, looked up with interest. "What's your vision, Helena? If this were—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "If this were everything you dreamed of, what would it look like?" Helena closed her eyes, allowing herself to imagine. Something intimate despite the size, warm lighting like sunset through stained glass, music that feels like heartbeats, elements of both our worlds, not just yours. She opened her eyes to find both men staring at her. "What?" "Write that down," Brian said to James, his voice rough with emotion. "Every word." James was already typing. "This is exactly what I meant. The board wants a statement wedding, but if we lead with Helena's vision and just scale it up." The elevator chimed again, the wedding planner arriving with her team. The next 2 hours passed in a whirlwind of fabric swatches, flower arrangements, and venue photos. Helena found herself gradually relaxing as she realized they actually valued her input, even when it contradicted traditional upper-class expectations. "The botanical garden is lovely," the wedding planner said, "but perhaps too expected for someone of Mr. Whitmore's standing." "It's perfect," Brian interrupted, surprising everyone. His eyes met Helena's. "It's where we had our first real conversation about books, remember? That morning you had off from both jobs, and we spent hours talking about magical realism under the glass dome." Helena's heart fluttered. They hadn't had that conversation. It wasn't part of their agreed-upon story, but the way Brian described it made her wish they had. The glass dome, she found herself saying, where the light made patterns on your face, and you told me about reading 100 Years of Solitude in college. Brian's smile was subtle but real. They were building this memory together, creating truth from fiction in a way that felt more honest than their practiced stories. After the planners left, James lingered, watching them with thoughtful eyes. "You two are getting better at this," he observed. "Almost too good." "What do you mean?" Helena asked, still arranging the fabric swatches into color stories that pleased her artistic eye. "The best lies have truth at their core," James said carefully. "And watching you two, there's a lot of truth happening." Before either could respond, his phone buzzed. "Speaking of truth, the media's requesting an engagement photo shoot, something intimate at home, showing your life together." He paused. "Think you can handle that?" Helena looked around the penthouse, at Brian's books now sharing shelves with hers, at her notebook sitting next to his laptop, at the way they'd unconsciously created shared spaces in this massive apartment. "Yes," she said softly, "I think we can be convincingly real." That evening, after Brian returned from his meetings, Helena found him on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. She brought him a cup of coffee, black, no sugar, exactly how he liked it. "Thank you," he said, making space for her at the railing. "For today, for all of it. I got something today," she told him, pulling her notebook from behind her back. "After everyone left, I needed to write again." Brian's expression softened. "Will you share it?" Helena opened to the fresh page, her handwriting dancing across the paper. "Perhaps love is not the grand gesture or the perfect story. Perhaps it's in the small moments, the shared coffee cups, the invented memories that feel more real than reality, the way two people can build a truth from careful fiction. We're learning a dance we've never danced before, and sometimes I forget which steps are choreographed and which ones just happen because our hearts know the rhythm." She fell silent, waiting for his response. Instead of speaking, Brian gently took the notebook, pulled out his Mont Blanc pen and wrote beneath her words, "Sometimes the most honest thing we can do is admit that we've stopped pretending." Their eyes met over the open page, the city lights casting shadows that couldn't hide the truth in their faces. The space between them crackled with possibility and fear, with unspoken words and unfelt touches. Inside, their phones buzzed with wedding details and media requests. Outside, the world waited for their perfectly crafted love story. But here, in this moment, they were just two people standing on a balcony, writing their own truth, one careful word at a time. James had been right. They were getting better at this. The question was, what exactly were they getting better at? The pretense or the reality that was slowly replacing it? The engagement photo shoot wasn't going according to plan. The photographer, a renowned artist known for capturing intimate moments of New York's elite, had arrived at the penthouse early that morning. Now, 3 hours in, Helena could feel Brian's frustration radiating off him in waves. "Maybe if you could just—" The photographer adjusted his lens again. "Be more natural." Helena fought the urge to laugh at the irony. They'd been posed and repositioned countless times, on the sofa, by the windows, in the kitchen, each shot feeling more artificial than the last. "Let's take 5, James intervened, sensing the tension. As the photography team stepped away, he approached Brian and Helena. "What's wrong? You two were more convincing at the press conference." "Because that was us," Brian said quietly, loosening his tie. "This is, performance art." Helena understood. The staged domesticity felt wrong because their real moments were so much more authentic. Their actual mornings involved Brian making coffee while she read the news aloud, casual touches as they navigated the kitchen, comfortable silences as they prepared for their days. "I have an idea," she said suddenly, slipping off her heels. "Give us 15 minutes, no camera, no direction, let us just be." The photographer looked skeptical but nodded. As the team filed out onto the balcony, Helena turned to Brian. "Dance with me?" He blinked, surprised. "What? Remember that night last week, when you couldn't sleep because of the merger stress and I found you listening to jazz at 3 a.m.? Brian's face softened at the memory. That night, they'd swayed together in the darkened living room. Not really dancing, but not really not dancing either. Just existing together in the space between friendship and something more. "No music?" he asked, already reaching for her. "We'll make our own rhythm," she replied, stepping into his arms. They moved together slowly, her head finding its natural place against his chest. Brian's hand spread across her back, warm and steady, while the other held hers over his heart. They weren't dancing so much as breathing together, finding the synchronicity that came so easily when they weren't trying. Click. The sound of the camera was distant, unimportant. Helena felt Brian's lips brush her temple, so softly she might have imagined it. Click. They shifted, and Helena looked up to find Brian watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. His hand moved to cup her face, thumb brushing over her cheekbone. Click. This isn't pretend anymore, is it? She whispered. Words meant only for him. Before he could answer, James cleared his throat. The board members are here. The spell broke. Helena stepped back, suddenly aware of the collection of suited executives filing into the penthouse. This was a scheduled meeting. How had she forgotten? But Brian's hand caught hers before she could retreat completely. "Stay," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're going to be my wife. You should be part of these discussions." The board members exchanged glances. This wasn't protocol, wasn't part of the plan, but Brian's tone left no room for argument. As the meeting progressed, Helena found herself drawn into conversations about company direction, community impact, and future initiatives. Her background in literature and her experience working multiple jobs gave her a perspective the board hadn't considered. When she suggested incorporating local businesses into their corporate sustainability program, several members actually took notes. "Miss Brooks," one of the older board members said during a break, "you're not at all what we expected." "Neither is she what I expected," Brian added, joining them with coffee cups for both himself and Helena, hers with exactly one sugar, just how she liked it. "She's more." The way he said it, with pride and something deeper, made Helena's heart race. This wasn't for show. The board members were in their own discussions across the room. This was just Brian, looking at her like she was something precious and surprising. After the board left, the photographer approached with his laptop. "I think we got it," he said, turning the screen toward them. The photos took Helena's breath away. There they were, caught in unguarded moments, swaying together, looking at each other, existing in their shared space. But it was the last photo that made her fingers tremble against the keyboard. It showed them in profile, Brian's hand on her face, both of them suspended in that moment before words could complicate everything. The late morning light painted them in soft gold, and the look in their eyes. "That's love," James said quietly, looking over their shoulders. "Real or not, that's what love looks like." Later that night, after Brian fell asleep on the sofa reviewing contracts, Helena sat in their darkened kitchen with her notebook. "Today I saw us through someone else's lens, and I couldn't tell where the performance ended and reality began. In every photo, in every touch, there was a truth we haven't dared to name. How do you tell someone that what started as lines in a script has become the most honest thing you've ever felt?" She closed the notebook and walked to the sofa, looking down at Brian's sleeping form. His face was relaxed in sleep, years younger without the weight of empire on his shoulders. She reached for the throw blanket they kept nearby, the one she'd brought from her old apartment, because he'd mentioned being cold during late-night work sessions. As she draped it over him, his hand caught her wrist. "Stay," he murmured, still half asleep. "Just stay." Helena hesitated only a moment before settling beside him. Brian shifted, making space, and she found herself tucked against his side, her head on his chest, his arms secure around her. "We should talk about this," she whispered into the darkness. "Tomorrow," he promised, pulling her closer. "Tonight, just let it be real." Across the city, their engagement photos were already being prepared for release, telling a story of love and connection. But here in the quiet of their home, wrapped in each other's warmth, they were writing a different story, one without cameras or scripts, one where truth and pretense blurred until neither mattered anymore. The wedding was 2 weeks away, and every rehearsal, every planning session, every shared moment brought them closer to a line they'd drawn in sand, watching as the tide of their feelings slowly erased it. James had been right. That's what love looked like. The question was, what were they going to do about it? 1 week before the wedding, Helena found herself alone in the penthouse, surrounded by wedding gifts from New York's elite. Crystal vases, designer table settings, and enough silver to fill a museum, all of it feeling somehow less real than the single book Brian had left on her pillow that morning. A first edition of The Lighthouse Keeper's Daughter, discovered at a small antiquarian bookshop in Boston during his business trip. The inscription inside had made her cry, "For the woman who taught me that some storms are worth sailing into." B. "The final dress fitting is in an hour," James announced, letting himself in with his emergency key. He stopped short at the sight of Helena sitting cross-legged on the floor, still in her pajamas, the book clutched to her chest. "Helena, I can't do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't pretend anymore." James sat down beside her, his expensive suit wrinkling against the plush carpet. "Who said anything about pretending? You don't understand." Helena removed her glasses, wiping her eyes. "Last night Brian was working late in his study, and I brought him coffee. He looked up at me and smiled, just smiled, and I felt my entire world shift. I wanted to tell him I love him, the real kind of love, the kind that has nothing to do with contracts or companies or convenience. Then tell him, and risk everything?" She shook her head. "This whole arrangement depends on clarity, on knowing what's real and what's for show. If I tell him and he doesn't feel the same..." "Helena," James's voice was unusually serious. "Look at me." He waited until she did. "Yesterday, Brian called me at midnight to ask if I thought you'd prefer peonies or garden roses in your bridal bouquet. Not what would look better in photos, not what the press would expect, what would make you happiest. The man who once forgot his own birthday because he was focused on a merger was worried about your flowers." Helena's heart thundered in her chest. "That doesn't mean—" "He reads your notebook," James interrupted. "When you leave it out, when you're asleep or in the shower, he reads your words like they're sacred texts, like they hold the answers to questions he's afraid to ask." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. All those moments she'd caught Brian looking away quickly from her open notebook, all the times he'd referenced things she'd only written about. A knock at the door prevented her response. The wedding planner's assistant had arrived with the final schedule for the rehearsal dinner. "Miss Brooks, Mr. Whitmore asked us to review these details with you personally. He says you have final approval on everything." Helena accepted the papers with trembling hands. Every page showed careful attention to the things she'd mentioned wanting, even in passing. The signature cocktail was a blend of chai and bourbon, combining their favorite drinks. The music selection included the jazz pieces they'd danced to that night. Even the table settings featured small lighthouses worked into the design. "He's been planning all this for weeks," the assistant said proudly. "Mr. Whitmore was very specific about incorporating elements that told your story." After the assistant left, James squeezed Helena's shoulder. "The dress fitting," he reminded her gently. "And tonight's the private rehearsal dinner." "Private?" "Brian's idea. Just you, him and me. A real dinner before tomorrow's formal rehearsal with the board and press." James helped her up. "He said something about wanting one last normal moment before the circus begins." The dress fitting passed in a blur of white silk and delicate lace. Helena barely recognized herself in the mirror, not because of the dress but because of the light in her eyes, the glow that came from finally acknowledging what she'd been feeling all along. That evening, she found herself in a private room at the small Italian restaurant where they'd celebrated their engagement. Brian was already there, his tie loosened, looking more nervous than she'd ever seen him. "James can't make it," he said as she sat down. "Emergency board call." Helena's heart skipped. "Oh?" He sent a rather cryptic text about letting truth find its own timing. Brian smiled, but his hands fidgeted with his water glass. "Helena, I need to tell you something." "Me too," she breathed, reaching for her ever-present notebook. "But let me show you first." She opened to the latest entry, written during the dress fitting. "Love isn't in the grand gestures or public declarations. It's in the coffee cups aligned on the counter each morning, in the way you dog-ear pages of books you think I'll enjoy, in the lighthouse you had etched into my necklace because you understand the power of symbols and storms. It's in every moment I've stopped performing and started living, only to realize that somewhere along the way, my heart forgot this was supposed to be pretend." Brian read in silence, his fingers tracing her words. When he looked up, his eyes held a vulnerability she'd never seen before. "Earlier this week," he said quietly, "the board offered to approve a different solution to the takeover threat. No marriage required. I turned them down." Helena's world tilted. "Why?" "Because the thought of not waking up to your teacups in the sink, not hearing you hum while you write, not watching you curl up in my office chair with a book when you think I'm too busy to notice." He took a shaky breath. "The thought of a life without those things terrified me more than any hostile takeover ever could. Brian, I love you." The words tumbled out, raw and real. "Not for the cameras or the contract. I love you for the way you see the world, for how you've made my life technicolor when it was grayscale before. I love you for your strength, your words, your heart. And I understand if this ruins everything, if this isn't what you—" Helena stood, walked around the table and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft, tentative, nothing like the passionate scenes in her romance novels, but it felt like coming home, like finding the last piece of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. When they parted, Brian's hands framed her face. "The wedding," he whispered. "If you want to cancel—" "No," Helena smiled through her tears. "But I want to change the vows. I want them to be real." "They always were," Brian admitted. "At least mine were going to be." James found them an hour later, foreheads pressed together, notebooks open between them as they wrote their true vows. He smiled, sent a quick text to the board. Plan succeeded, real love accomplished, and quietly closed the door. In the warm light of the private dining room, two people who had started with a contract found themselves writing a different kind of story. One where love wasn't a performance, but a truth, finally spoken aloud. And somewhere in the city, a lighthouse pendant caught the light, its tiny waves and tower a reminder that sometimes the safest harbor is found in the heart of the storm itself. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and crisp, autumn sunlight streaming through the botanical garden's glass dome. Helena stood in the bridal suite, watching her reflection as the makeup artist made final touches. Her wedding dress caught the light, the intricate lace pattern casting delicate shadows on the floor. "You're something borrowed," James said, entering with a vintage silver hairpin. "It was my grandmother's. She wore it when she eloped with my grandfather, against everyone's expectations." He smiled, carefully placing it among her elegantly styled braids. "She always said some loves are worth defying convention for." Helena touched the pin gently, emotion tightening her throat. "James, thank you not just for this but for everything, for seeing the truth before we did." "Speaking of truth," he pulled an envelope from his jacket. "Brian asked me to give you this. No peeking until I leave. I've had enough of watching you two make heart eyes at each other." Once alone, Helena opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a page torn from Brian's personal journal, something she'd never seen him write in before. "My dearest Helena, by the time you read this, we'll be hours away from saying vows that started as business and became the truest words I'll ever speak. But there's something you should know. That first night at the hotel when I asked you to dinner, it wasn't spontaneous. I'd watched you for weeks before that, watched how you treated every guest with dignity, how you wrote in your notebook during quiet moments, how you adjusted your glasses when you were thinking deeply about something. I'd already fallen in love with you before I ever proposed our arrangement. The contract was just my coward's way of keeping you close, hoping that maybe somehow you might see me as more than the CEO everyone else sees. You once wrote about storms worth sailing into. You are my storm, Helena, the one that swept away all my careful plans and pretenses, the one that showed me what it means to truly live rather than just exist. Meet me under the glass dome. Let's get married for real. All my love, Brian." Helena pressed the letter to her heart, tears threatening to ruin her perfect makeup. She reached for her notebook one last time, as Helena Brooks. Love stories aren't supposed to start with contracts and corporate takeovers. They're supposed to start with chance meetings and instant connections. But maybe that's why ours is better, because we built it slowly, carefully, truth by truth and moment by moment, until what started as ink on paper became the most authentic thing either of us has ever known. A knock at the door announced it was time. The botanical garden had been transformed into something magical. Soft lights twined through exotic plants, creating an ethereal glow. The glass dome above sparkled like diamonds, and scattered throughout were tiny lighthouse replicas, each holding a candle that flickered like distant beacons. The string quartet began playing, not the traditional wedding march, but the jazz piece they danced to that night in the penthouse. Helena took her first step down the aisle, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Brian stood at the altar, but not in the rigid pose of a CEO. His posture was open, vulnerable, his eyes shining as they found hers. James stood beside him as best man, discreetly passing him a handkerchief. The gathered crowd was a who's who of New York society, board members, business partners, media personalities, all there to witness what they thought was the culmination of a whirlwind romance. Only 3 people knew the full truth, and that truth shone in every look, every subtle touch, every shared breath. "Friends and family," the officiant began, but Brian raised his hand gently. "If I may," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "Before we proceed, I'd like to share something with everyone here." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket, not the formal vows they'd practiced, but something new. "Helena," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I came to you with a contract, thinking I could control love like I control business deals. I thought I could write terms and conditions for how my heart would behave. I was wrong. You taught me that real love doesn't follow a blueprint. It builds itself in quiet moments, in shared books and midnight conversations, in the way you leave your teacup on my desk when I'm working late, in how you see the man behind the CEO. Helena's hands trembled around her bouquet. This wasn't what they'd rehearsed. This was raw, real, and completely unscripted. So today, in front of everyone, I'm tearing up every contract. He pulled out their original agreement and ripped it in half, drawing gasps from the board members present. I'm not marrying you because of business or convenience. I'm marrying you because you make me want to be worthy of the way you look at me, because you write your truth in notebooks and somehow wrote yourself into every corner of my heart. Because with you, I'm not Brian Whitmore, CEO. I'm just Brian, the man who loves you more than his next breath. Tears flowed freely down Helena's cheeks as she stepped forward, pulling her own notes from a hidden pocket in her dress. Brian, she began, her voice steady despite her tears. I came into this thinking I could keep my heart safe behind walls of practicality. I thought I could sign a contract and keep my feelings separate, controlled. But love doesn't work like that. Love sneaks in through the spaces between carefully chosen words. It builds homes in the margins of notebooks and the quiet moments before dawn. She touched the lighthouse pendant at her throat. You gave me this necklace to remind me of storms worth sailing into. What you didn't know was that you are my lighthouse, the steady light that helped me find my way back to believing in love. Every cup of coffee you make just the way I like it. Every dog-eared page in books you think I'll love. Every moment you look at me like I'm something precious. They're all chapters in the real story we've been writing together. James stepped forward, presenting the rings, not the flashy diamonds the press expected, but simple bands engraved with tiny waves and lighthouses. With this ring, Brian said, his fingers trembling as he slid the band onto her finger, I promise to love you not for show, not for business, but for all the beautifully real moments that make up our life together. With this ring, Helena echoed, placing his band with steady hands. I promise to love you not because of any contract, but because my heart chose you in every unscripted moment we've shared. The officiant barely finished pronouncing them husband and wife before Brian pulled her into a kiss that felt like coming home. The gathered crowd erupted in applause, completely unaware that they'd just witnessed not the end of a carefully orchestrated performance, but the beginning of something genuinely extraordinary. As they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, Helena caught sight of James wiping his eyes. He gave them a slight nod, part congratulations, part acknowledgement of a plan that had worked better than anyone could have imagined. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, church bells rang. But Helena and Brian were lost in their own world, where contracts had turned to love stories, and business arrangements had bloomed into something real and wonderful and completely uncontrollable. Their story hadn't started like a fairy tale, but it had become something better, a truth written in shared moments and quiet understandings, in torn-up contracts and heartfelt vows, in the space between what they'd planned and what they'd found instead. 1 year later, Helena sat in what had once been Brian's study, but had gradually transformed into their shared space. Her laptop was open to the final page of her manuscript, not the business proposal she'd once dreamed of writing, but a novel about love, trust, and the courage to be real in a world of carefully crafted appearances. Still editing? Brian's voice came from the doorway. He'd loosened his tie after a long day of meetings, but his eyes were bright as they found hers. Almost done. Helena saved the document and closed her laptop. The publisher wants the final draft by Friday. Brian crossed the room, perching on the edge of her desk, a habit he'd developed over months of late-night conversations. Are you sure about using our story, even with the names changed? Some stories need to be told, Helena said, reaching for his hand. Not for the romance or the drama, but for the truth beneath it all, about how love isn't always what we expect it to be. He brought her hand to his lips, kissing her wedding ring. Speaking of unexpected love, James sent over the final numbers from the merger. And? The board was right. Our marriage did stabilize the company. Brian's smile turned wry. Just not in the way they thought it would. Your community outreach programs have transformed our corporate image. Turns out authenticity is good for business. Helena stood, wrapping her arms around his waist. Is that CEO speak for my wife was right? That's husband speak for I fall more in love with you every day. He kissed her softly, then pulled back with a sparkle in his eye. Which reminds me, I have something for you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped package. Helena opened it carefully, to find a beautiful leather-bound notebook with a lighthouse embossed on the cover. "Open it," he urged. Inside, on the first page, was a familiar piece of paper, their original marriage contract torn in half at their wedding. But around the torn edges, Brian had written in his strong handwriting, "Some contracts bind us to terms and conditions, but the greatest contract of all is the one written in heartbeats and morning coffees, in shared dreams and quiet understanding. I love you not because I signed a paper, but because you wrote yourself into every page of my life. Your lighthouse in every storm." Helena felt tears welling up. "Brian, there's more," he said softly. "Turn the page." She did, and found a series of photographs, their first genuine smile captured at the engagement photo shoot, their dance under the glass dome at their wedding, a quiet moment caught by James where they were both reading, Helena's feet in Brian's lap, their spontaneous trip to the actual lighthouse that had inspired their story, where Brian had held her in the rain and promised that some loves were worth getting wet for. "James helped me collect them," Brian explained. "One real moment for every fake one we once planned." Helena touched each photo gently, remembering, "We've come so far from that first night at the hotel." Speaking of the hotel, Brian's voice held a note of excitement. "The board approved my proposal this morning. We're converting the top floor into a writer's retreat, a place where people can come to find their stories, just like you found yours." Helena stared at him, speechless. This had been a dream she'd mentioned once, months ago, during a late-night conversation. "You remembered," she whispered. "I remember everything about you," he said simply. "Every dream, every hope. That's what real love is, isn't it? Paying attention to the small things that make up someone's heart." Helena turned to the blank pages of the new notebook, picked up her pen and began to write. "Love isn't in the grand gestures or the perfect moments. It's in the way he remembers how I take my tea, in the dog-eared pages of books we share, in the space he makes for my dreams alongside his. We started with a contract to fool the world, but in the end, the only ones fooled were ourselves, thinking we could control how and when and why we fell in love. Today, marking 1 year since we tore up our carefully written plans, I realize that the greatest love stories aren't the ones we plan. They're the ones that write themselves in the margins of our lives, in the spaces between what we think we want and what our hearts know we need." Brian read over her shoulder, his arms wrapped around her. "Does the story have a happy ending?" "No," Helena smiled, turning in his embrace. "It has a real one, which is better." Just then, James burst into the study waving a newspaper. "Have you seen the reviews? Helena's advanced chapters are being called a revolution in modern romance and a raw, honest look at love in the age of appearances." Brian beamed with pride. "Of course they are. She wrote the truth." "Speaking of truth," James grinned, "you might want to check your phones. That photo of you two at the lighthouse went viral. Something about CEOs can be romantic, and real love in the corporate world." Helena and Brian exchanged amused glances. The photo, taken by James during what was supposed to be a private moment, showed them dancing in the rain, Brian's suit soaked, Helena's hair wild, both of them laughing like teenagers. "Should we make a statement?" Brian asked, slipping naturally into CEO mode. "No," Helena said, touching his cheek. "Let them see the truth. That's what we promised, remember? No more performances." He caught her hand, kissing her palm. "No more contracts. Just love," she finished. Later that night, as the city lights twinkled beyond their windows, Helena added one final line to her notebook. "Some people spend their lives searching for the perfect story, but the best stories are the ones that break our carefully constructed plots, that come in through the side doors of our hearts when we're busy making other plans." Brian and I started with a contract, but we'll end with something better. A love story written not in ink but in countless real moments, each one more authentic than the last. And maybe that's the greatest truth of all, that love doesn't need contracts or conditions. It just needs two hearts brave enough to tear up the script and write their own story. James found them asleep on the study's couch, Helena's notebook open on her lap, Brian's arm protectively around her. He quietly took a photo, one more real moment for their collection, and slipped out, smiling. On Helena's laptop, her novel waited to be sent to the publisher. Its working title glowed softly on the screen, "The Lighthouse Keeper's Truth, a love story without contracts." Outside, the city continued its eternal dance of lights and shadows, but in their shared space, Brian and Helena had found something better than the perfect plan or the ideal arrangement. They'd found their truth, written not in contracts or conditions, but in the indelible ink of real, unscripted love. and that was worth more than all the carefully written plans in the world. 5 years later, the Daily Grind Cafe looked different now, transformed from a modest coffee shop into a cozy literary haven. Bookshelves lined the exposed brick walls, and comfortable reading nooks invited visitors to stay a while. Behind the original counter, a familiar face smiled as she prepared a chai latte. "Still remember how to make these?" Helena asked, handing the cup to her husband. Brian took it with a smile, his steel blue eyes twinkling with the same warmth they'd held 5 years ago. "Some things you never forget," he replied, watching as she wiped her hands on the apron she insisted on wearing during their monthly ownership shifts. Their tradition of working together at the cafe they now owned, but kept under its original name. The cafe had become more than just a business venture. It was their bridge between worlds, where CEOs and baristas could sit side by side, sharing stories and dreams. The writing workshop they hosted every Wednesday evening had launched 3 published authors, and the wall behind the counter proudly displayed Helena's 3 best-selling novels alongside photographs of their journey. "Uncle James," a small voice called out as the door chimed. Their 4-year-old daughter Luna ran toward James, her dark braids bouncing, her father's blue-gray eyes shining with excitement. James scooped her up, his casual elegance unchanged by the years. "There's my favorite storyteller. Did you bring your notebook?" Luna proudly patted the tiny notebook hanging from a string around her neck, a miniature version of her mother's, complete with a tiny lighthouse embossed on its cover. "She insists on writing everything down," Helena said, watching their daughter, "just like her mama." "Speaking of writing," James settled Luna on his hip, "have you told Brian about the movie offer?" Brian's head snapped up. "Movie offer?" Helena adjusted her glasses. Some habits never changed. "They want to adapt The Lighthouse Keeper's Truth for the screen. But," she smiled, reaching for Brian's hand, "I told them our real story is still being written." Brian pulled her close, kissing her temple. "Best plot twist ever." "Ew," Luna giggled, covering her eyes. "Daddy's being mushy again." James carried Luna to her favorite corner, where a child-sized desk held her growing collection of stories. At 4, she was already weaving tales about brave princesses who ran companies and lighthouse keepers who found love in unexpected places. Helena watched them go, then turned to her husband. "Do you ever regret it, buying this place instead of expanding the corporate headquarters?" "Never," Brian said firmly. "This cafe was where you dreamed of writing, where I fell in love with you over morning coffee and borrowed books. Some investments are worth more than money." He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a familiar worn notebook, Helena's original one from their early days. "I found this while we were organizing the study." Helena opened it carefully, finding the entry from their first night at the hotel. Her fingers traced the words, "Sometimes the most significant moments come disguised as ordinary decisions." "We've come full circle," she murmured. "Not quite," Brian smiled, turning to the last page. There in his handwriting was a new entry. "5 years ago I thought I was writing a business agreement. Instead, I was starting the first chapter of the greatest love story I've ever known. Here's to all the chapters yet to come, my love. All of them real, none of them planned, and every single one better than any contract could have promised." Helena felt tears welling up, happy tears, the kind that came from having more joy than your heart could hold. "I love you," she whispered, the words as true now as they were the first time she'd said them. "I love you too," Brian replied, then grinned. "It's in the contract." "What contract?" James called from Luna's corner. "You tore that up, remember?" "The only contract that matters," Helena laughed, touching her heart. "The one written here." Luna ran back to them, her tiny notebook open. "Mama, help me tell the story about the princess and the businessman." Brian lifted their daughter onto the counter, and Helena felt her heart swell as she watched them together, her brilliant CEO husband, who now read bedtime stories with different voices for each character, and their beautiful daughter, who had inherited both her mother's creativity and her father's strategic mind. "Once upon a time," Helena began, winking at Brian, "there was a woman who worked 2 jobs and wrote stories in secret, and a man who thought he could control love with a piece of paper," Brian continued, pulling them both close. "But instead," Luna added, reading carefully from her notebook, "they found out that the best stories write themselves." James snapped a photo of the moment, another one for their collection. In it, they were laughing, Luna perched between them, their faces glowing with the kind of happiness that couldn't be scripted or planned. Outside, New York City continued its eternal rhythm, but inside the daily grind, a family had found their own perfect cadence. Their story had begun with a contract. evolved through carefully crafted appearances, and blossomed into something beautifully, wonderfully real. And in the end, that was the greatest love story of all. Not the one they'd planned to write, but the one that had written itself in their hearts, one unscripted moment at a time. The end. Based on this emotional story of Helena and Brian, here is an impactful question. If you were in Helena's shoes, would you have the courage to sign a marriage contract with a complete stranger, even knowing that it could completely change your life? In a world where appearances and social status are so important, would you risk everything for a chance, however small, to find true love through a business deal? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. Your participation is very important to us. See you next time.